Now, the purpose of the theme adjuster is to allow us to personalize how Reaper looks. How it looks over here with these elements, and in the mixer, and a whole bunch of other contexts, as you'll see. Now, to get to it, we'll go up here to the options menu and go down here to themes. Now, it's important that we're using the default 7 theme, as the theme adjuster was designed to work with it. And also make sure you're using REAPER 7.17 or later, as the theme adjuster doesn't come with the older versions. And then we can choose it right here, and it opens up and looks like this. Now, it's important to be aware that there's no way of messing up anything in the theme by fiddling around with any of these controls. We can always get it all back to its default. So if we were to go to the track controls and hide all the elements in the track control panel, like this, we could always go back to the global tab and go down here and choose reset all values to the default. And everything will come back to the default. So don't worry about messing anything up in here. Play with it all you want. So let's go through this. First, we have the global colors. Right over here, we can apply the custom color to track labels, which is basically the track names over here. And we can see by default, they're already set to the color of this track right here. They're basically tinted to these colors. We could turn this off right here, and now they're just white. So if you prefer not to have the custom color on the track name, we could turn it off right here, which is my personal preference, as the track names tend to stand out more. Then over here, we can control the custom color of our track. By default, this custom color is not really the color that's chosen. It's this color over here. This is a dimmed down version of it. If we want it to be even dimmer, we could bring this down to nothing. Now that color isn't on this section at all. It's just over here. If you want it to be stronger, we could bring it up or completely up. Now it's the same from here to here. It's not dimmed at all. So if you want the exact same color, just bring this fader all the way up. But by default, it's at 30%, which brings up a feature of the entire theme adjuster. If we double click any fader, it goes back to the default. Or we could double click the name of it right here, does the same thing. We could also grab the fader to adjust it, use these arrows over here to adjust it, put a mouse over here and use the mouse wheel to adjust it, or put a mouse wheel on the fader to do the same thing, or double click the number, and this dialog opens up where we could type in a value. So those are the options that exist for all the controls in the theme adjuster. Let's put this back to the default by double clicking here or here. Now the next option is the global text brightness. Because I kept my text white, this is going to affect how bright it is. Bring it down, it's very dim, and we'll see this in the transport as well. Bring it up or down, make the text very bright. Again, double click it to bring it back to its default, double click here, or use the mouse wheel to adjust this setting. Then over here, we have the indication of track selection. When we select the track, it looks like this. It's a bit brighter than before. The track name gets inversed. Before, it looked like this, and after, it looks like this. And then finally, we have an indication dot over here. This is white, while these are black. So those are 3 different indications of our track selection. And we can adjust that over here. If we want it to be brighter, bring this up, or dimmer, bring it down. We could turn off, invert the label text and background, so selecting our tracks doesn't invert the name. Or we could turn off this dot, and the dot doesn't show up on the track, just the other 2 indications. So in theory, we could bring this all the way down, turn these 2 options off, and if we select our track, we're not really going to see that selection. So you probably want to use at least one of these options. Have it get a bit brighter, have it invert the track name, or at least use a selection dot. So you can see what track is selected. But by default, these three options are all on, and the track gets a bit brighter. Next, we have a custom color palette, and we could use this to change the color of our tracks. So we could select this track, maybe change it to this color, and select this track and change it to this color. But what we could also do is recolor the entire project using a chosen palette. So if we choose this cool palette and hit this button, it changes the color of all the tracks randomly to a custom color from this palette. Now you might be thinking that this would mess up your current colors if you already had them grouped by color, like one color for drums and another for guitars, but it won't. It will still keep tracks that are the same color with each other. So if we choose these two, for example, to be purple, and these two to be this greenish color, we can now recolor it with a different palette, but these groups of colors will stay the same with each other. These colors are the same, and these colors are the same. So we'll keep our grouping of tracks together while recoloring our project using the palette we choose. Then down over here, we have the color processing for the theme. This is very useful if your room is too dark or too bright and you want to adjust for that. Or if you just want to tweak the overall color profile of the theme, we could do that in here. We could adjust the gamma, the highlights, midtones, shadows, the saturation of color, black and white, or oversaturated, or the tint of the colors. So as you can see, you can mess this up very easily. You can always reset it right here, reset all color controls. And they all go back to the default. But we could always double click over here, or the fader, to reset the individual values. Then down over here, we have our parameter management. As I mentioned earlier, we can completely reset our theme right here. But we could also export anything we change about the theme to a file, which is really useful if you just make a few changes and you want to be able to import just those changes to the theme without affecting other changes you may have made, as opposed to this option, which is going to save all the parameters from the theme, changed or not, allowing us to completely save our work as a fully modified theme. Next, we have the track controls, starting with the track panel, where we can drag our elements to reorder them. Over here, we see the elements on the track control panel. So right over here, we can reorder those elements. So if we want to take our mute and solo button and drag it over here, so it's first on the track, put it back, move the routing before both, or the effects button, or the panning, or move the envelope button, we can change the order of anything over here. And down over here, we can choose the background color for our track. As I showed you before, right over here is a dimmed version of a custom color for this track. What's blended with that color is a background color we could choose here. By default, it's this color. We could choose something darker, or something like this, or choose our own custom color to be the background color for our tracks. Click it here. Let's choose this color right here. Now this color is the background color for all our tracks regarding their custom color. Let's put it back to the default. Now over here, we can choose the divider opacity. Right over here is the divider line for our tracks. We can make it dimmer so it disappears, or more pronounced so it shows up clearer. But again, we can put it back to its default. Now down over here, we can decide the folder indent. If I make these tracks folders like this, we'll see these tracks indent from the left to the right, and we can control how much they indent right over here. We can bring it down so they don't indent at all, or bring it up so they indent quite a bit. Put it back to its default. Now down over here, we can adjust the X spacing, which is basically the elements left to right. So if we make it bigger, the elements are further away from each other, or closer together if we bring it down, further or closer. And we do the same thing with the Y spacing, which is up and down. Make them further away or closer to each other. If you want to save space on your tracks, let's put them back to the default. Then down over here, we can choose the balancing method for how the elements line up when we have folders. Notice these elements don't line up. Record buttons over here, here, and here. They're out of line with each other, which might be fine for you, but if you don't like that, we could choose the stretch name method. So now our effects buttons line up, the record buttons still don't, and the name of the tracks don't, but these do and these do, so it's a bit more aligned, before and after. But if you want it completely aligned, we could choose Balance All. And now all the elements are exactly in the same space on each track, even though the tracks are still indented. So all the elements still line up from top to bottom, before and after. But by default, it's set up like this. Now everything we've done in here is going to affect all layouts, A, B, and C, but the next sections, like the visibility programmer, can be different in each layout. Layout A, B, and C. And we can see that if we go up here to the View menu and choose Screen Sets Layouts, we can go to our layouts, and by default, all our tracks are going to be Layout A. Let's change this one to be Layout B, and this one, Layout C. Notice I'm using 200%. You could use any percentage to change the size of your elements. So instead of choosing 200% C, I could choose just C, and the elements are a lot smaller. I'm just making them bigger so you can see them better. But now I've chosen this track to be Layout A, this one B, and this one C. And you can see they all look different. So like I said, we could set up many of our choices to be different for Layout A, B, and C. We're going to focus on Layout A for most of this video to keep it shorter. As you can see, it's getting pretty long. Next, we have the Visibility Programmer for the Track Control Panel. This decides what elements we see on our track depending on different conditions. Over here, we have those elements, and over here, we have those conditions, starting with if the mixer is visible. So if we make the mixer visible, these elements over here, the routing button, pan, and polarity button are all hidden in the track control panel, with the concept being we don't need to see them over here as we get adjusted on the mixer. Just keeps the track control panel a bit simpler. And if we close the mixer, they come back. But if you don't want that, you could change that in here. Then we have if not selected. As you can see, none of these are chosen, but if we choose our mute and solo, routing, and effects, those are now hidden in the track control panel unless we select the track, like this. So they come back just when the track is selected. Just meant to simplify what we see in here, but these are off by default. And then we could choose what we see if our track is not armed. As you can see, our monitoring modes, our record mode, our input, and the meter values are all hidden when the track is not armed. Again, to simplify this, put this track in record, and now we see those options. Our monitoring mode, our record mode, and our input. Take it out of record, and we don't see those options. Again, just to simplify what we see. But if you don't want that, just turn these off, and you always see these options, whether the track is in record or not. But you can see how busy this gets, which is why it's set up this way, to keep it looking a bit simpler. But again, if you want to see everything, just turn these options off, and we'll see everything, even if the track is not in record. Then over here, we have always. This is meant to allow us to hide anything all the time. So if you never want to see mutant solo on the track, we could hide it right here, and we're never going to see the mutant solo on this track, whether we select it, put it in record, or show the mixer. It's always hidden because we chose it over here. And we can see right down over here in this layout, the label and values are always hidden. We can turn this off. Now we see our values on our track for our volume and our pan. So if you want to see this all the time, unselect this option as it's hidden by default. And again, it could be different for layout A, B, and C. Then down over here, we have the track panel, letting us adjust the label font size. By default, it looks like this. We can make it bigger or smaller. We can adjust the length of the track name right here, make it bigger or smaller. So if we have really long names on our track, we can't see all the letters in the name. So if we want this bigger, make it bigger, so you can see the name of our tracks bigger. And over here, we can adjust the size of our volume fader. By default, it's set to a knob, at least in layout A. Layout C starts with a fader, but we could change it on layout A to be a fader instead. Right here, we can use the fader to adjust our volume on the track. And we can adjust how big it is right here. Make it as big as you want, or as small as you want, or bring it all the way down until it turns into a knob. Then we have the input font size, which we can only see by putting our track in record. Here's the input size. So we can make the font bigger or smaller, or change the size of the name. Right now we could see it like this, but if it's too big, we can make it smaller. If we choose an input with a long name, like this one, you might want to make this bigger, so we can see the whole name of our input. Then down over here, we can adjust our meters, or the size of them. By default, they look like this wide for our metering, but we can change it to be wider right here. If we go wide enough, they become horizontal instead of vertical. Make them big, or make them as small as you want, really skinny, but the default is this size. Let's make them bigger. Over here, we could adjust the meter border. It could be smaller or bigger, creating a bigger border for our meters. And again, adjust it to any size you like. Then down over here, we have the section assignments, dealing with our effects inserts, our parameters, our track sends, and the effects user interface on the track control panel. So let's add some effects to this track. Go to effects chain, add one here, which has an EQ, compressor, and an EQ. And we can see over here, the effects inserts can show up on the track control panel just by hitting this X. Now we see them on the right side. We can do the same thing with sends. Let's create some sends from here to here and here to here. And we can have them show up on the left side if we move it, if we hit this X. So now we have our track sends on this side and our effects on the right side. But of course, we could switch it, put the effects over here, the sends over here, and they show up on the opposite sides now. But we could also see our parameters and our effects user interface in the track control panel as well. Let's switch these again. Let's go to this effect. Let's choose this parameter and give it a track control. Make this track bigger so you can see it down here. And the parameter shows up on the bottom. But we can move it to the right side. Now it shows up over here. But notice it stays with its effect because the parameters group with the effects inserts or the sends when they're in the same section. But let's put it back over here. Now if you can see down here, we have the effects user interface. So let's choose this EQ and right-click it and show the embedded user interface in the track control panel. Now that shows up down here, but we can move it to the left, put the sends over here, or to the right, put our effects inserts over here with the parameters, and move them around to any section we want. We'll put them unassigned up here, so we won't see them at all, at least in layout A. Again, this could be different for layout A, B, and C. Let's put them back with the effects over here, sends over here, parameters over here, and the effects user interface on the bottom. So now we can adjust the size of each section over here, adjusting the width. Make the left side wider or skinnier, adjust the right side the same way, and adjusts how it looks over here. But if you notice, these tracks over here look a bit different, as they don't have effects or sends on them. So the elements don't line up with this track. If you want that, we could pin these parameters right here. Now we have a section over here just for our sends. We'll do the same thing with our effects. Pin them with this button. Now they show up over here, leaving a section for our effects and our sends on the left and right side. Let's move our parameters to the bottom. Now down over here, we have the section properties. This decides how wide each section could be. Our parameters are minimum and maximum, our inserts minimum and maximum, and our sends insert and maximum. So we can adjust the size completely separately for each one of these sections. Then down over here, we could adjust how the empty section looks over here. When we pinned it, notice this color matches this color a bit. It's a bit darker. We could adjust that with the empty section opacity. Bring it all the way down. Now the color matches exactly. Or bring it up and the color's gone and it matches this exactly. Now these empty sections, we could still add effects in here or sends from in here. But it lines up all the elements perfectly because they're pinned from over here and over here. And now we adjusted the color how we want it to look. Again, keeping the same color, making it dimmed, or making it the same color as up here. And then finally, over here, we have the section margins, which is how far apart all these sections are. Make it bigger, so they take up more space, or make it smaller, so they take up less space. But this is the default. Then down over here, we have the master track. Let's view our master track right here. Shows up here. We could change the background color like we did with the normal tracks. Defaults to this, or we could change it to this, this, or this, or even choose a custom color if we want. Now it looks like this. So we could choose any color we want for the master track. Put it back to the default. We could also adjust the volume length. Just like with the tracks, we have a knob. We can make it bigger to create a fader as big as we want, or as small, or a knob. We could also show the master label, so the name of the track is hidden, or shows up, or the values for the track. How loud it is right here, or the panning as well. If we don't want to see that, we could turn it off right here. And we could also adjust the meters on the master track separately from the other tracks. We can make the meter bigger or smaller, so it shows up really wide and horizontal, or really narrow and vertical. Really tiny, make it bigger, it's any size we want. But the default looks like this. We could also adjust the border for it over here. No border takes up less room, and a big border around our meter. And then finally, we could hide the meter values so we don't see them on the meter. Show them or hide them. So those are the track controls. Next, we have the envelope controls. Right over here, we have envelopes for this track, and we can control how it looks in here. Starting with the background color, it defaults to this. We could change it to this, make it lighter or darker or even lighter, or give it a custom color. Choose something like this. Now our envelopes have that color, but it defaults to this color. And we could also choose to show the value readout. We could turn it off. We don't see it. Turn it on, and we do. We could also inherit the folder indent from the track. By default, it's on. So if we put this track inside a folder, notice the envelopes indent along with the track. If we don't want that, we can turn it off here, and the envelopes don't indent. They move over to the far left. But this is on by default, so they will indent. We could adjust the label font size, make the font bigger or smaller. We could adjust the fader length. Here's our fader for the envelopes. We can make it bigger or smaller. If we make it really small, it turns into a knob. But by default, it looks like this. Then over here, we could adjust the label length or the name length. If you want it to be really big, Usually, we can make it even smaller, giving us more room to make the fader longer. And again, this is all customized for how you prefer to work. Then we could adjust the custom color strength. Before we chose our color, but the envelopes can inherit the custom color from our tracks. So if we bring this up, the color strength gets stronger to the custom color on our track. Or make it dimmer, or turn it off altogether. Then we have the divider opacity for the envelopes. Right now it's this thick, or we can make it thicker, or remove it completely. By default, it looks like this. So that's the envelope control panel. Next we have the mixer controls. Over here we see our mixer, and just like with the other views, we can adjust the background color. It defaults to this light gray. We can make it darker, somewhere in between, or this, or again, give it a custom color with this color in the background, but it defaults to this. And we also have the divider opacity. Our divider lines are right here. We can make them disappear or more pronounced. Then we have the folder indent. Right now I have these tracks in folders, each one in a folder of the track next to it. And you see at the bottom, they indent. They go higher or lower. But we could change how tall that indent is right here. We can make it disappear so they don't indent at all, even though they're still folders, or we can make them indent a lot, like this. But the default is this. Let's make them indent a bit more. And when they indent, it also puts these elements out of alignment with each other. If you want that to stay in balance, we could choose this. Now these elements are in line with each other, but this is off by default. Make this smaller. Then down over here, we could show the effects inserts, parameters, or sends. Right now we're seeing that stuff up here, our effects inserts, our parameters, and our sends. If we want to hide that, we could turn each one off. And if we turn all of them off, it gives more room for our faders, before and after. Let's put these back on as they're on by default. Then we have the mixer panel, starting with the label font size, or the name of our tracks. We can make that smaller or larger. This one's important. This shows the labels and values of our tracks. It's off by default, so if I move my fader, I don't see the value it's changing to. If you want that, just turn this on. Then we see the values over here. Move my fader, I can see exactly where it goes. And the same for pan. If I pan this, we can now see it's in the center or any place in between. But by default, this is off, so we don't see those values. If you want that on, turn it on here. For me, I like to keep this on. Then we have the show meter readout, which shows this number right here, based on the metering on this track. If you don't need to see that, we could hide it, which I tend to do, so I see this number all the time, which for me is more important than seeing this number. This way you don't confuse the two. But by default, this is off and this is on. Let's leave this on for now. Then over here, we have the three different states for our tracks: unselected, selected, and armed. And we can adjust the width differently for each. Now when we change the width, it's going to adjust to three different sizes. If we make it really small, it's known as a strip. Make it bigger, it changes to reduced, and then bigger, it becomes standard, which you can make bigger or smaller. But as we make it smaller, it goes to reduced and then to strip. Let's keep it on strip for now, and then we can change what happens when it's selected. Let's select track 4. Notice it changes to standard. Let's change this to be reduced, and that looks different from the other tracks. Let's put track 5 into record or arm it, and now it shows up as standard right over here. So we can adjust this size differently. Let's make it bigger, or we could add a sidebar right here, showing our effects on the side over here instead of on top. And we can add a sidebar to this one as well if we want. And we could adjust a sidebar width up here, how wide it is or narrow, based on all the tracks that have the sidebar turned on. And we can turn on and off our meters for each one of these options. Now up here, we have the expansion by channel count. This is what happens if we have more channels than 2 on a track. Like for this track, we'll go to the routing, and let's change it to 8 channels. And that expands how wide this meter is. And we can adjust it right here. Make it really wide for 8 channels, or keep it narrow or no change at all, compared to only 2 channels. But by default, it'll be 2 pixels wider. So this is armed, this is selected, and this is unselected. And we can change each one if we want. And again, it can be different for each one of our layouts. Then we have the width control. If the width is standard, which is just this track right now, we can turn off the dark strip under the buttons so it looks like this, as opposed to this. Then we can choose which buttons we see. We can turn off the routing, effects, envelope, and phase, but it only affects the standard width. It doesn't affect these. Then we have hide sections based on their view. This is based on the input section and pan section, or if it's reduced based on the input, button, and pan. This is only going to be noticeable if we adjust the height of the mixer, make it smaller. Then we can change the input section, and it's going to hide or show based on the value in here. Notice the input section is now hidden, or the pan section can be hidden once it gets to this value. And with reduced, which is this track right here, we could hide the input section, the button section, or the pan section. It's only going to be affected if the height of a mixer is a bit smaller. Then over here, we have the strip width, which is only going to affect these tracks over here. Let's deselect this one and take this track at a record. Now all these tracks are unselected, and the width is a strip, which we could adjust over here. We could change the order of our elements, put this up here, put a fader over here, the effects down here, the input, the envelope. All these elements can be changed, or their order can be changed just by dragging them around to change the way our strip looks. But it's only affected when we use strip. And then finally, we have our mixer preferences. We could add a clickable icon for folder tracks to be hidden. This little button right here, we turn it off. It doesn't show up over here. We can show multiple rows of tracks when size permits, and show maximum rows even when fewer will fit. And then finally, we have the master mixer, which is not being shown right now. Let's show it on the right side, and it looks like this. We could adjust how it looks, changing the color, changing the panel width to be wider or more narrow, show the values or not, the labels or not, or the meter values or not. So that's the mixer controls. Next we have the transport, which is down here. We could start off with the transport margins, make them smaller, putting our elements closer together or further apart if we want. Then we have the rate knob, which starts out as a knob, but if we make it bigger, it turns into a fader or slider. But it takes up more room and sometimes removes other elements from the transport, depending on the size of your elements you chose in your layouts. Then we have the status display width, which includes our numbers and the play state as text. If we make it smaller, it takes up less room. It makes the numbers even smaller, or it takes up more room if we make it bigger. Let's put it about here. Then we have the selection font size. Now if you notice, down here, we don't see our selection, even though I have one at the moment. We have to make this a bit smaller, make this smaller as well, and it shows up down here. This will depend on the size of your transport that you set up in your layouts, whether we see this or not. But we can adjust the size of it right here to be smaller or bigger. and it works with this as well. And we could also adjust that selection font size to make the text bigger or smaller to make the text smaller. Then down over here, we have the transport colors. Again, by default, we're using this color. We could change it to this, or even a custom color if we want. And that changes the background color in the transport. But again, this is the default. And we change the status display color right here. Again, this is the default. Change it to this, or again, a custom color if we want. Then over here, we have the transport preferences. We could show the play rate control. If you don't use this a lot, it's a good idea to hide it, as it makes more room on our transport for other things like the status display or the selection display. But this is on by default. And we could also choose to center our transport controls right here, which puts these transport controls in the center instead of on the left. Then we can show or hide the time signature. If you don't need to see this, again, we can make more room for other things like the status display or the selection size. But this is on by default. So we'll see a time signature down here. Then we can choose to use previous or next. When we use the transport forward and back, instead of just going to the beginning or the end, we can choose this and it'll go to previous or next markers or regions. This is off by default. Then we could show the play state as text, which we're seeing right now. Again, if you don't need to see that, we can get rid of it, giving us more room for other elements if we want. So that's the transport. Now I know this video is very long, but I really thought it was worth going through everything, as a great deal of time was put into creating the theme adjuster. So hopefully this will inspire you to modify the Reaper 7 theme for yourself. So that's pretty much it. That's the theme adjuster for Reaper 7. I hope you learned something, hope you could use it, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.
Bingo, boys, let's go.
Bye.